So welcome everybody to the first research seminar of the fall here at the Institute for Future Studies. I'm very pleased to have Anders Sandberg here. He's going to talk about Serf's Up, Law, AI, Singletons and Leviathan. So Anders has, as many people who do very interesting stuff in future study, a diverse background. He has a Ph.D. in computational neuroscience. From where? I don't remember. KTH?
From Stockholm University.
Stockholm University, okay.
Although my office was over at KTH.
Okay, that's why I'm confused about it. He's a researcher here, which I'm very happy, but also a senior research fellow at the Future Humanity Institute at Oxford, which we collaborate a lot with. And he's also a project member of this research program, the Mimer Center for Long-Term Futures, that Karim Yabari is leading, that I've started here. And your research the last 20 years, as long as I knew you, on the ethics of human enhancement, global catastrophic and existential risks to humanity, reasoning about emerging technology and other highly uncertain topics, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and long-term trajectory for human civilization, and even more than that. And you publish in a diverse number of papers on these issues. But the floor is now yours. Welcome.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be back here. And I'm giving this talk also partially together with Cyril, my co-author, who's sitting over there, who I'm going to refer all hard questions to, of course. He's going to try to bounce them back to me. The story behind this is that in 2020, Cyril was guest professor in Oxford, which is not a good year to be a guest professor in Oxford because of lockdown. So we were sitting in my garden at epidemiologically safe distance, shouting research ideas at each other and kind of trying to send food across a long table. And we were thinking about many different things. Questions about existential risk were obviously very present. We were thinking about artificial intelligence. We were talking about, well, what about the role of government in protecting us against big disasters, as we were kind of hearing the ambulance sirens in the distance in the otherwise very quiet northern Oxford suburb. And that led us to start thinking about something that we got a concept. We called it the serfdom conclusion, which is a little bit of a riff on Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. And that's also why the title, at least in the program of this paper, is Serf's Up. I changed the title because last week we were visiting a friend who's a very good author, and he has dissed the title and told us to change the title of the book that emerged from this to something sensible. And this is the current state of the book. That little idea in the garden turned into a paper that turned out to be very awkward, and we decided let's dilute it in the shape of a book and see if we can actually get something together. And this is the current state of this little project, and I'm going to give you a kind of overview of what's going on, and then hopefully you can explain to us that actually most of this is well known and the original stuff is the wrong stuff, but we'll see where we're getting. So the basic theme of this is saving the world requires global coordination, but global coordination might also threaten our individuality and autonomy quite strongly. So how do you balance this? That's really what we're trying to deal with in the book. So I'm going to do a super quick rundown with a slide with far too much text about the kind of reasoning we're doing. So the first point is that what's the point of laws, markets, etc.? Well, they allow us to coordinate. We are rather limited beings. We have limited cognition. And we outsource a lot of our cognition to other people and sometimes pieces of paper. And that allows us to actually achieve really useful collective results. That gives us peace and prosperity. Yay, this is good. It also means that we get various rules. And we also seem to have evolved a tendency to follow rules, especially when people frown at us for not following the rules. Even if you don't get caught by the police for disobeying the rules, you still quite often want to follow those rules your mother told you to follow, because you know deep down that that's probably the right thing to do. So this produces a pretty nice outcome. Because of reasons, we call this the natural intelligence singleton. Now, that seems to be nice. And it also seems that
Could you explain why you call them natural intelligence singletons?
Okay, so I'm going to do a little jump ahead here, but Nick Bostrom, my boss in Oxford, he wrote a paper on the concept of a singleton. And he argued that, well, we might want to consider that you could have an agency that can dominate the entire world, that actually can make sure that if it wants to do something, it gets done, and you can't unseat it. And he was thinking about this in the context of existential risk. He was basically, in this paper, he's not strongly arguing that this is necessary. In his later vulnerable world hypothesis paper, which I'm going to return to, he more or less suggests this is actually something we might really need to survive. And that leads to a lot of interesting and very awkward conclusions. But that concept of a singleton, you have this centralized locus of power, which might be a person, it might be a government, it might be an AI program or something else. That is an interesting concept. So we started playing around with lowercase singletons. Instead of a capital S singleton that runs the world, you could imagine smaller singletonish things, like the law. There is, in most societies, just one legal system, and you're not normally allowed to set up extra legal systems, although there is interesting complications here. So quite often it's not really a singleton, but a kind of polyton. There are actually several little singletons, but often they hook into each other in a somewhat stable way. Now, that is where we started with, and it's very possible that singleton is the wrong word. So if you get annoyed enough at my usage of singleton here, please give us some better words, because we might. This is at the stage where we can actually do a global search and replace, and actually come up with better terms. There are quite a lot of terms in the current manuscript that have to be changed because they only make sense to Cyril and me, and usually after enough coffee or wine. So they might have to change before it's a publishable book. Now, the interesting thing about these kind of systems is that designing it from the ground up is actually really hard. So I think a good example might be the attempt of building a communist or a socialist system where people tried to construct something according to theory, and that didn't turn out very well in terms of peace and prosperity for people. That still has some interesting lessons about the fundamental problems to cognition. And as I already mentioned, we have this problem of existential risk that might motivate rather extreme actions to safeguard humanity. And that might mean that we really want to have a capital S singleton or something like that. The problem is, of course, that's also an extremely scary prospect. Now, we also have artificial intelligence, which is both contributing a fair bit of risk to the existential risk discourse, and also gives us a good reason to really want to have better forms of coordination, because dealing with AI risk is probably more of a coordination problem than a technical problem. But you also get systems that are non-human but can perform cognitive and action tasks, and that might actually allow you to outsource coordination to non-human systems. That means that you could make a kind of artificial intelligence singleton, which might actually be quite effective in achieving peace and prosperity in various forms. However, the natural intelligence singleton runs very much on human autonomy. You need autonomous decisions to make this work well. While the artificial intelligence singleton at most makes use of AI autonomy, we might actually end up finding that there is no need whatsoever for human autonomy, and then we end up in what we call the serfdom conclusion, that from a practical standpoint it's wrong to be autonomous and you should just do what the computer tells you to, which sounds awkward. That doesn't sound like a conclusion you would want. The question is, what's wrong with it? What's going on here? And also, do we have a way of having our cake and eat it? Can we actually get the benefits of global coordination, new forms of efficiency, without having to give up stuff we cherish and that makes us human? So that was the book, and now you basically know everything. Now it's just a few clarifications for the rest of the talk. But any questions on this starting point? No, just shocked silence.
Why don't you just call it like some kind of coordination system rather than singletons? And they can be more or less dominant.
I think that is an interesting, because there is a fair bit of literature on coordination systems in both sociology and economics are, and I think this is something I would love to discuss, for example, with Pontus and other people in the social sciences here, what terminology people actually use, because I think there is a risk that if you use the wrong word, people will assume that you're meaning a particular thing. The nice thing about Singleton is that it's somewhat underused, but maybe we should use something that's not even bad. You had a point?
Well, it makes me think of the singularity.
Mm.
Like, do you want that?
It's accidental, but I actually have a section about why the singularity is not needed for the argument. But the words are similar, and it's kind of annoying because they have nothing to do with each other. Boström singleton is called a singleton because it's a single thing, while a singularity is called a singularity because, at least in mathematics, when they showed up, they used to be seen as, oh, there's a single point where everything breaks down. And then, of course, other mathematicians quickly found out, oh, I can have singularities along lines, knots and fractals and all sorts of lovely stuff. And then the AI people took it over and used it for something completely different that has nothing to do with actual singularities most of the time. But it's a good point, and that's another stroke against the word singleton. Yeah.
Keep the question of clarification a bit slow, so
Yeah.
to minimum, so he can go on. But a quick one.
Well, but I'm really liking this one because
I
I
know,
think
I
this
know.
is
Right.
important.
I
Yeah.
understand that. It's nice.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so you're right, of course, that like using a term that people have strong associations with, like other associations, that has costs. But also like using a novel term, I think that has costs as well. So people don't sort of connect it with relevant literatures and feel it is a bit idiosyncratic. So are there other people besides Boström that use this term singleton? Or?
In his sense, it's mostly been used by people citing him, so
Right.
it's a small branch there, and it's not a big literature. But that might be big enough that it already caused enough people to have connotations. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, we might.
In the discussion, for example, when it comes to violence, you usually say the state has monopoly on violence and things like that. So those terms are used quite a lot.
Oh yeah.
Monopoly or
Yeah.
oligopoly.
Yeah, but it gets complicated because these things are not necessarily monopolies in the monopoly terms. But let's go on and run through this, and then we can see if it makes more or less sense. So what we do when we start out the book is having a few hefty chapters that we do a detour into metaethics. And this is partially, of course, because the legal tradition in Sweden has a long philosophical approach going back to Hägerström, where you end up with the legal realism. Okay, law should be a science. What is it a science of? Where is law? What is these things? And when you try to be really scientific, you end up with the problem that you start getting your doubts about that morality. You can't point to the moral right. You can point to people and other things, but you can't point to that. That doesn't seem very scientific. So there is this school of thought that, oh dear, we can't bring in any of that ethics stuff, which usually shocks a lot of people from the more British and American legal traditions that think that that's actually kind of inherent. But what happens over in the Swedish tendencies, you go from this naturalism over to legal positivism, saying actually laws are what the government decides to enact as laws, and they might, in the best of all possible way, have some moral content. But typically people then move over to non-cognitivism and error theory in ethics, saying actually, at least over here in the law faculty, we shouldn't be doing any ethics whatsoever. And that ethics talk might actually not point to anything in reality. It might just be wrong. So, it's equally wrong to say that it's wrong to murder as saying it's right to murder. Wrong and right here don't point to any particular facts. And you can resolve this in various ways. Now, it's kind of an interesting thing because of this kind of error theory, I don't really believe in that myself. I'm just working with it. And there is an interesting reason here, and that is if this is all about kind of non-moral prescriptivity, telling people what we ought to do or not, from a practical standpoint, you can still argue, of course, that, yeah, actually, as a utilitarian, I think that practical prescriptivity generates now a lot of utility. And a Kantian might happily say, oh, yes, you're following actually moral rules, even though you don't call them moral rules. But by not assuming any normative theory, or at least a very weak one from the start, hopefully some of our conclusions are going to remain true, regardless of what other normative theories the reader have. That's at least the hope we have. This is also hopefully going to be somewhat compatible with the line of reasoning people do in legal studies in Sweden. And it's also interesting to see that you can argue for these error theories by saying that, yeah, there might be an evolutionary debunking. We seem to have evolved a lot of things like a sense of justice. But that is actually a problem for thinking that justice is a thing, because evolution might just work to optimize our fitness. So if we share resources well inside our tribe, that's going to be great. We're going to have a lot of grandkids. But that doesn't necessarily track that it's morally correct or right in some external sense that we're sharing things equally. It's just that it generates fitness, and then maybe evolution will motivate us, so we develop an innate sense that fairness is kind of important. We get upset when we see unfair things. But that's not evidence that there actually is something like fairness out in some abstract world. Now, this kind of evolution debunking doesn't disprove ethics or anything, but I'm going to return to another evolution debunking much later, where interesting things happen. There is, of course, an interesting question. Well, what does this actually practically lead to? And in many cases, much less than you think. But generally, we should expect societies to want to develop some normative rules that allow them to function. Even if these rules don't track any Platonic truth about morality, it's still very useful not to kill each other. It's very useful to share resources and come up with some order. So you can skip a lot of the fancy and ethical stuff and still get this. And then, of course, we can discuss what kind of beings we are. And as I mentioned, we might have evolved a whole bunch of emotions that makes us rather happy to be subjected to normative influences. So we're not driven by the morals, but we certainly respond a lot to other people's approval and disapproval. And we have a kind of urge to take normative statements rather seriously. We're also boundedly rational agents. We're not that smart. So we try to fix this by, for example, copying behaviors from other people, which means that we copy a lot of smart behaviors that are very useful and a lot of random stuff that just becomes superstitions. So a good example of this is Heinrich's book, The Secret of Our Success, where he points out that there is a lot of cultural practices that are actually fairly complex, and in a normal traditional environment it's hard to figure out what actually works for real reasons and what is just superstition. And spending resources on even doing that investigation is usually too expensive if you're living in a limited world. So it's better just to believe all of that stuff and follow it. And that way you can have fairly tricky things like how to get rid of cyanide from manioc to eat it, which is totally non-trivial, but you need to do it. But then it gets surrounded by a lot of rituals. And people don't know that it's about cyanide, but instead tell a story about how you need to perform these rituals, otherwise ancestor spirits will make you sick, etc. And then things get interesting because we copy a lot of details in how we worship ancestors into the cooking system, and then that becomes part of the cooking. And even today you get weird things. I have another paper about food combination superstitions in Myanmar, and I've been looking at how people have weird beliefs about combining different foodstuffs. I was told by an expert very seriously that, oh yes, ginger and manioc must never be combined because that releases the cyanide from the manioc. This is really interesting. I started looking into it, and there's no evidence whatsoever I can find for that this is actually true. There is actually a nice recipe of a ginger manioc cakes from the Maldives that I want to try at some point. But this food expert believed it because now that traditional beliefs about how you should handle manioc got transferred into the modern world. You find the same thing in a lot of beliefs people have about the paleo diet, which actually turn out to partially, through a few indirect steps, be from Ayurvedic traditional Indian medicine. And it's not even the same recipes for what you're supposed to eat. It's the explanations they came up to why you should eat in a particular way that through a bunch of health fads in Germany in the 1800s ended up in the modern paleo diet. And they're still as fact-free as before, but now people give explanation. Oh yes, the enzymes in your stomach, you need to break things down, and you haven't evolved to eat certain food stuff in certain orders. but this is kind of just random copying of other people and experts saying solemnly that this is important. Okay, sorry, getting off topic here, although it's a fun off topic. Now, the interesting thing here is, of course, that we accept a lot of rather bad reasons for these non-normative, prescriptive things. And we build these epistemic systems by institutions, rules, etc. And then, if they function well, then things go well. So then we perform the task of building this non-normative, practical, prescriptive, this big system that extends our minds. And it's both culture in general, but also more specific institutions. So it's interesting to think here about the rule of law, for example. It's not just that the police need to be fair and effective and non-corrupt and the legal system works. It's also that we, the citizens, need to know this. And the law needs to know that we know it, etc. And so we have a common knowledge component that is quite essential for the rule of law. It's not enough that the actual police is honest. And this generates these interesting non-material epistemic artifacts, whether that is the law or market, etc. And they can sometimes be designed, sometimes you enact a law, and sometimes they're just grown like a market. And quite often there is a lot of stuff in between. And this is, of course, where we are going to exploit this a little bit later, because if you accept some form of extended cognition hypothesis here, that we have externalized a fair bit of cognition to these artifacts, then it's kind of natural to imagine that in the future AI might take a role, the same role, or replace it partially or completely. There is also another thing that's worth noticing here. I've been kind of talking about this lovely thing that maximizes peace and prosperity, and there is another P, of course, and that is power. There's a lot of people actually really like to have a power, and they're going to exploit this system rather ruthlessly. So power, you can define that as the power of making somebody else to do what I want when they would not normally have done it. That's kind of using Dahl's definition. And many people have then nuanced it. Dahl does it immediately when he writes his paper, pointing out that actually there are different kinds of power, different bases of power. Later people have said, oh yes, and setting the narratives is another form of power. You don't actually have to exert your power. It's enough that people know you have power, that you can scare them to do what you want, etc., etc. So there is a rather complex aspect of how power is done in human society. But the practical and brute fact is there are some people who are very willing to use power to get what we want. And they, of course, that means they manipulate people in ways that are not in their interest. At least usually not in their interest. And this is both bad for the people that might get coerced into various things or manipulated, and it might be bad for these extended artifacts for the general utility, because now they get biased towards making the power seeker and doing the bidding of a power seeker. But that, of course, naturally means that these systems will tend to develop defenses. Either because nice people realize, oh no, what if some scary sociopath try to take over a garden association? So let's set up a few rules to make it harder for somebody to take over the garden association. But also, once the ruthless power seeker have dominated the garden association and can get his will done, he realizes, oh no, there might be somebody else want to steal the organization from me. I need to set up these systems to protect myself. So these protections against takeovers and the exertion of power would kind of naturally emerge in various forms. That doesn't mean that now we're ending up in some optimal state that everything is perfectly fine. Actually, quite a lot of these orders are quite dreadful for the people involved. A lot of human history has been relentless oppression. But it's interesting to note that oppression actually requires quite a lot of outsourcing of cognition. It's not like the dictator can tell everybody what they need to do. In fact, most successful dictators are very good at getting a distributed system where people oppress themselves, which is, of course, making it extra dreadful. But this is an interesting line of thought that we haven't developed much yet, but I think there is a lot more that can be said here, including, of course, why you might end up with Singleton-like things rather than Polyton-like things. Because if you have multiple centers of power, at least the power seekers are going to eye each other and try to see if they can bring the others in line. Having effectively, stably multiple centers of power can be tricky unless you can kind of lay them as different magisteria, like that law and the markets can be separate because they actually help each other by being separate. If they get too close to each other, quite often you get interesting trouble. Okay, so you end up with this kind of iceberg of a society. So we have on one hand on top the very legible part, the legal systems, post- och inrikes tidningar as a kind of way of creating common knowledge by being a newspaper of public record. And then we have, of course, a lot of ice under the surface. That is a lot more of a grown artifact. It has emerged from a lot of interactions between bounded agents, copying, cultural stuff, power struggles. Many of these power struggles, incidentally, are a little bit like the virus DNA that is inside our DNA. Sometimes it does get repurposed over time. There are some genes that were originally viral genes that are absolutely essential for us mammals to form a placenta. And quite a lot of the institutions we have in society are in some sense derived from various medieval noble families struggling and finding some solutions that then got taken over by later governments and repurposed in various ways. And we are mostly interested here on the normative-ish stuff, but there is obviously a lot of the more practical, non-normative things going on here. Okay, so now we end up with the glorious natural intelligence Singleton. So now we have a kind of coordinating device solving, hopefully, the deadly coordination problems for societies. And that is great. And we have the normative Iceberg, and we have things like enacted laws on top. And this might be kind of invisible hand. Now, this is nice. We get kind of individual rationality and social rationality aligned with each other. Partially, of course, because a lot of individual rationality get told very strongly by the rest of society, you ought to behave like this, and people incorporate that in their own views and values. But there is a way of dealing with this. And this is kind of our story about what most societies are like. Then, of course, you can say, okay, couldn't we design a better one? And that's, of course, the classic idea with socialism. So you could just rationally design a society that would be fair, just, and efficient, and instead of this complicated, horrible mess that have emerged because of these past interactions. And then, especially if you look at the market part, there are these classic critiques. Ludwig von Mises brings up that, you don't get a price mechanism in a planned economy, and that means that you're not going to be good at allocating things in the right way.
So you're really talking about a planned economy, not about socialism.
Yeah, we are mostly, but that is
socialism.
partly because we haven't built the real socialism part of the book yet. But I think the planned economy is probably the cleanest part of where it's failing in an interesting
Can have
way.
a planned economy also in a fascist state, for example.
Yeah,
They will have the same problem.
Yeah, exactly. And we probably need to extend the chapter in a lot of interesting directions. But the general problem is the technocratic solution quickly runs into trouble. So the Mises critique is, of course, you don't have a price mechanism, that's not going to work well. Hayek is, of course, even more on our side, kind of arguing that, yes, individual freedom is actually really necessary for actually doing the computations necessary for figuring things out here. By having a lot of human minds in a distributed fashion solving this, that's where important stuff happens. And then we get putting the knowledge into the system, and the system can then start maximizing welfare. Now, one interesting thing is when you start looking at a planned economy from a computational complexity perspective, and this is the part of the book where I'm starting to bring in my equations and so many footnotes with very obscure abbreviations. It's interesting because you can start thinking about how hard is it actually to plan an economy. And in computational complexity, we typically talk about two complexity classes, P and MP. P represents problems that the difficulty of solving them grows polynomially with the size of the problem. While MP, it contains P because polynomials are contained among the non-polynomial things, but typically they grow exponentially or worse in size as you look at bigger instances. And that typically means that you can't solve them. The classic example of something MP is the traveling salesman problem. You have a number of cities, you want to find the shortest route that goes through all these cities. And it turns out that the number of paths you need to consider grows with the factorial, and that is impractical to deal with, and so on. And typically people say, yes, polynomial stuff is tractable. This is strictly speaking not true, though, because polynomial things can still grow in complexity much faster than is practical. So the good news about, if you think about the simplest case of a planned economy, it's a linear programming problem, as it's called. You assume that the various utilities are linear, you assume that you have various constraints, they're all linear, and now you just need to solve it. Then it turns out that the amount of computation you need to do roughly grows at the number of goods involved to the power of 2.5. This is not too bad. I've seen much worse. But from a practical standpoint, this is really impractical. So it turns out that Amazon in 23 has about 12 million items, and there seems to be about 350 million items in the marketplace sellers list. And given that most of these items are built out of a lot more stuff that is only sold inside the industry. Yeah?
What is that number?
2.5 or... Sorry?
Yeah, give him a microphone.
Yeah.
So,
I just wanted clarification on that 2.5 number where it appeared from.
So that's from, I think this is the ellipsoid algorithm. There is a big footnote here to be made, because there are slightly faster ones, etc., etc. But they are so-called galactic algorithms that are actually too slow to actually work on Earth. So there is a big section in the book. I'm very happy to discuss that with you later. Basically, the scaling is still above 2. But you can get closer to 2 if you're willing to make some trade-offs. So there are some interesting issues here. But yeah, the important thing is the number of goods in a normal economy seems to be on the order of a few billion, at least in the current era. And that is kind of makes a few billion to the power of 2.5 is a large number. Now, a lot depends, of course, on your computing power, but it turns out that when you actually try to solve this as a linear programming problem, it literally takes geological time. You can't actually do it. It's kind of amusing that this point was already made by Pareto in 1925 when he was writing that, in this economy there is 17,000 goods, and that's impossible to calculate. There is not enough pen and paper. Yeah. So that is not true. Today, solving this kind of problem for 17,000 goods, that's done by your cell phones. That's not a problem. But it seems like an actual economy is too big, especially when you also realize you need to index these goods to where they are, and there are services, etc. So this is a really big problem. And Moore's law is not going to solve it until we get Jupiter brains, and by the point we can build Jupiter brains, we probably have a bigger economy, because there is at least the supply chain for making Jupiter-sized brains. So that's not good. Quantum computers might shave off a factor of a half in the best case scenario. There are limits on how much the algorithm can become faster. So this looks bad, and parallelization don't give you that much. Now, there are other solutions, of course. You could start splitting the economy into pieces. You can decentralize it. Decentralized economic planning is an idea socialists have been proposing. The problem is that many parts of the economy are actually deeply interconnected, so this is very hard to do. And actually doing an optimal decentralized planning is, again, an NP hard problem. And then you can also start doing approximations. Now, if you start doing approximations, you end up with things a bit like prices, and suddenly you're back in the Soviet Union, where actually shadow prices and profits that were not actually profits, but in practice were profits, became a part of the way you run the economy. So here we could tell a happy, triumphant story about, yeah, look at Pareto, Mises, and Hayek. They're so totally right, and we liberals totally rule forever. Of course, there is a fair bit of socialist critique that don't quite buy that Mises and Hayek won that debate. But the problem is, of course, if you start thinking about the market economy from the same perspective, you actually end up with a lot of the same problems. The efficient market hypothesis actually implies that P equals MP, which makes most computer scientists say, what? That's kind of absurd. And it turns out that it's a little bit of wording. The normal way people talk about the efficient market hypothesis is way too strong. If you soften it a bit, there is no real problem. A more concerning thing is, a lot of economics is based on the idea that we can find equilibrium. But this is also an NP-complete problem. And there are some nice theorems showing that, the worst case time complexity of price formation is exponential. Yet the price of this glass obviously was finite and it didn't take eons to converge on. So something is wrong here. And what's actually going on is, of course, it's not just that we have this lovely distributed market calculating things. It's also that we're doing an awful lot of approximations. And that is the dirty secret of theoretical computer science. We have these amazing theorems about worst time complexity for many problems. We can really prove that it's exponentially hard to do them. Yet FedEx and the other companies, they're solving the traveling salesman problem very profitably every day and sending trucks around and delivering goods really well. And we do that by using an approximation scheme, and there are even some interesting bounds showing that you can approximate up to within, I think, about 0.5% of the optimum of a traveling salesman problem if you're really, really pushing it. Probably they are not pushing it that strongly because it's not worth getting those last percents because there are other sources of noise. These approximations are actually what makes, sadly, a fair number of theorems in theoretical computer science about how hard problems are much less useful than they are. Because if you can approximate them quickly and efficiently in a polynomial time, it doesn't matter if they're NP complete. And even if you have something with a bad time complexity, it might still be that you can approximate it well. There are, however, some inapproximability theorems showing that sometimes there are modes, that there are limits on how well you can do it. So this gets very messy very soon. But stepping back a little bit to what we're aiming at here, what's actually going on here is probably a good case of Bostrom's law, that if you see a way of distributing or handling something that works in real life, then the theory better allow that. If your theory tells you that that cannot happen and people are still solving a market problem or handling a tragedy of the commons by setting up cultural institutions, okay, that wins. That wins over any amount of theory. And it's an interesting case because it seems like these computational limitations, they could have been much worse. We could imagine a world where Gödel and Turing ruled, and all these problems were NP complete or worse or even uncomputable, and nothing could really ever be done and computed. We're not living in that world. We could also imagine another world that maybe Kantrovich and Danzig and the other linear programming people would like to live in, where it's actually really efficiently optimizable. In that world, you can just do your planned economy fairly easily. We're not living in that world either. We're living in this kind of weirdly intermediate world, a kind of Midgard between the Hel and the Asgard of the others, where you have problems, and they're somewhat tractable, but not always. And even thinking about whether something is tractable is quite often a hard problem. You quite often can approximate solutions, but that means that you get noise into your solutions, etc. Now, this is really an interesting situation to be in, and that brings up, of course, Herbert Simon's kind of classic thought experiment about the Martian looking using his sociologist telescope at Earth and noticing that, yeah, there are these big blobs of bureaucracies, organizations, and planned economies called companies or the Soviet Union, and between them there are these connections of free market. And what Simon noted was that seems to be a fairly neutral balance. The relative size of the planned part of the economy, after all, Walmart is in some sense a gigantic, rather successful planned economy, is dependent on that it's exploiting a bit of the approximation solutions in between. But this balance depends on issues like the transaction costs, as Coase would bring up. Coase's argument is that the reason we have firms is that that brings down transaction costs. And Simon argued that, yeah, there is things like coordination, authority, and a lot more social stuff holding together organizations. And more recently, Cesar Hidalgo has argued that actually it's the complexity of running things that create this compartmentalization that makes things more effective. This gives you a nice story about why we have the mixture we have. Suppose we now add artificial intelligence to that. That seems to be able to change the balance. Even if it changes just slightly, you might actually see a rather drastic shift. Because if it's easier to add AI and create coordination, bring down complexity or handle a lot of complexity in an effective way, you get a different scaling. And suddenly you might actually see that planned economies, whether they are in a socialist state or Walmart, might grow quite a lot. You might actually have much less need for the really informal approximations. So I should just briefly skip past the existential risk because it's of course a super mega important topic, but I think most of you know a fair bit about it. We tend to talk about it a fair bit. The reason I'm bringing it up here is that it also acts as a very powerful motivator. Because a lot of its most serious existential risks are very much coming from a governance perspective. Nuclear weapons would not have been developed, most likely, unless we had intergovernmental strife. And preventing these kinds of risks requires usually great coordination globally, and bad coordination triggers quite a lot of these risks, and we're not great at global coordination. So while the story here might be mildly triumphant about, okay, we're coordinating societies and companies fairly well, and there is friction and inefficiencies, but not super bad. And yeah, some of them are dictatorships and oppressive ones we need to do something about, but it still kind of works. However, if you now think there is existential threats that might just wipe us all out if we handle them badly, whether that is engineered pandemics or nuclear war or badly aligned AI, we need to coordinate things. And it's very hard to grow these epistemic artifacts when single mistakes are terminal. Most of these epistemic artifacts come about when people try things, people go bankrupt, people copy traditions that are pointless. And even now, if you think about the different reasons we might want to avoid existential risk, they generally give them top priority. And that means that they seem to be almost giving top priority to do anything to avoid them, which of course leads to various concerns about it. So I earlier mentioned Nick's vulnerable world hypothesis. Basically, there might be doomsday technologies out there. If we discover it, it's very hard to keep society safe. Michael Nielsen, in a brilliant little essay earlier this week, talked about doomsday questions. Are there short questions that would actually give you information enough to really destabilize the world? And would it be possible to get answers to them from advanced AI? And it's very unclear where the limits are on these questions. So the argument Boström had was that, well, the current anarchic world order looks very unable to handle this kind of threat, so hence we need a way better in a form of coordination. And this is, of course, where you can think about Leviathan. But also Torbjörn Tännsjö has recently come out with a book where he's arguing that we don't just need world government, we need a kind of world climate despot to solve the global coordination problem here. So you find quite a lot of strong views that we need really firm coordination against these really scary problems. So Boström Singleton is kind of an interesting one because he's trying to analyze it in a more abstract way. He's kind of leaving all the political science out, which is interesting from our perspective because we might want to think about AI systems that are not human. Now, one interesting problem with the Singleton concept is, of course, you can think of it from a cybernetic standpoint. You have something that's supposed to be coordinating the world. What properties does this system have to have? So there is this Ashby's law of requisite variation, which is kind of an old-fashioned term for information. It came about near the start of cybernetics. Today, the control engineers would call it the internal model principle and say that, yeah, that's nothing cool. You can prove it very easily on a few lines of math on the blackboard. But it basically says that if you want to control something perfectly, you need to essentially have as much information inside your system as what you're trying to control and ways of affecting that other system well. This gets rather tricky if the other system is the world. So you have a problem. What do? Well, maybe you accept it and say, well, we need to just have a singleton that's bigger than the world. So maybe we have Earth being a paradise because the singleton runs it, but the rest of the universe is the singleton kind of with computational powers and actuators manipulating the world. Or it keeps the world from growing too much. If we want to go to space in the first case, the singleton needs to colonize a few extra galaxies to handle Mars too. Or it says, no, you're not going to allow that. That's going to be too tricky. The problem is when you start thinking about what is unmanageable complexity, you realize very quickly that, again, the computer science issues means that actually unlimited computational power, even of a laptop, is very hard to predict. Actually, the singleton should probably keep me from using a too powerful computer. Actually, the singleton probably needs to keep the world very, very simple in order to manage it well. The second way out is, of course, to note that actually a reasonable singleton doesn't need to care about everything. You could imagine a singleton devoted to preventing nuclear war. And it doesn't care what people do in their bedroom or how they trade, as long as there is no fissile materials around. So we might say, okay, it's totally fine that it put in Geiger counters everywhere on the planet, because that's the only thing it cares about. The problem there is, of course, now you have a system that might be very effective in preventing people from doing something nuclear, but it's not going to stop other risks. It seems to be missing a lot of that. And if some people really want to unseat it, it also is unclear how does it prevent them from unseating its power. So it needs to actually care about what people are up to in other domains. So it seems slightly tricky. The third way out is, of course, to accept an approximation, actually. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to perfectly model the world perfectly. Instead, it just approximately models the world well, especially in the domains we care about. And that's, of course, the more plausible thing. There is also the alignment issue here. Because it's pretty obvious that if you put the world in the hand of anything, whether that's United Nations plus or a big AI, if that doesn't have our value, say, at the best interest, things could go extremely badly wrong. And that alignment probably is, of course, closely related to another big debate that I don't have time at all to get into because I'm already running way over time. But we all know the AI.
Not yet over time, but in 5 seconds you will be over time.
Good timing. Yep. Now, the interesting thing here is that, again, what is the worry about AI risk? Well, basically, we seem to be getting rather powerful systems that have properties that make them hard to manage in a safe way. So there are especially interesting things about convergent instrumental goals. It's useful for quite a lot of systems to gain control over their environment, to prevent other systems from turning them off, to changing the values, etc. And human values are actually quite tricky to specify, and it looks like we can get rather powerful AI. And alignment might be very hard. So big debate here to be had about how to go about that and what we need to do. This is however, the interesting thing is when you start thinking about how could you get existential risk from AI, most people will bring up only one a kind of version of a standard scenario. The simplest one is kind of the robot uprising, which is actually older than AI itself. It's literally a few decades older than robotics. But the brute force cases, you get a system that's very intelligent or capable in some sense. It doesn't have alignment with human goals. It takes over the world because of some instrumental goal or because it's been ordered that maybe by misinterpreting instructions or by malicious people. And then you end up that a world that is actually de facto run by something that's not aligned with our survival and our goals, and sooner or later we get run over. There is a lot of debate about that one. I think many people regard that as a kind of default scenario, and a lot of heat in the debate comes about because people find that more or less plausible. Quite often because you can make very vivid pictures about how it happened. I think there are more subtle ones. So you could imagine one where AI is pretty aligned. It's pretty useful, and everybody will within a year get themselves a personal digital secretary that is going to make life so much more practical. And of course, all companies are going to try to employ AI in a lot of functions because it's actually really good advisors. It's really good automation. And more agency is de facto, if not de jure, placed in these systems because it's very, very convenient. It's very economically efficient. It's kind of stupid for a company not to do it. They will be outcompeted. And if you don't use your digital secretary to the fullest, you're going to have a hard time actually functioning in the ever more complicated economy and society. What then happens is that these systems develop rapidly in unsurveyable ways. And then you start getting emergent goals and behaviors that are separate from human interests. And at that point, it's impossible to control it since now too much human agency has actually de facto been ceded on the growing AI side. So in some sense, this is very similar to how we individually are disempowered by organizations and companies and markets. It's just that the natural intelligence Singleton quite often emerges from this. Now you're just getting the AI Singleton emerging from this outsourcing. And as states demonstrate, this can quite often be quite deadly. States misbehaving towards their citizens is one of the leading causes of multi-million dead in the history of the world. But you can also get a version of this scenario where it's not so much that the AI takes over as it causes us to align with the AI values or emergent values that we didn't really plan to have. Again, you do this outsourcing and it's very helpful, but you get a feedback loop of values. You can imagine, for example, the Chinese Communist Party using AI to make really good propaganda, to make a harmonious society that is not going to upset the party and its goals, and making sure people are really believing this very efficiently. But the party is controlling the algorithm. The algorithm is not controlling the party, as the leadership happily tells themselves. And then the next generation of party members show up, and they have grown up in this system. They have values set by the algorithm. And as they march up through the ranks and as they get older, eventually the party is run by the algorithm, and the party runs the algorithm, and they can't get out of that. And if that's badly aligned, again, you end up with potentially existential risk. Finally, you might, of course, have a takeover where somebody says, oh, we need that climate despot, and I don't trust any human, so I'm totally going to hand it over to the AI. So here are takeover scenarios, and we can imagine that if we do alignment well, we can avoid them. But the interesting part is, of course, we might actually end up developing them even with aligned AI. So it's not an existential threat, but we end up with what basically that we have a very effective solution to the problems of coordination. And then, unfortunately, human autonomy is not needed. This, of course, is extra problematic if you start out like we did by looking at this very instrumentally and assuming that normative moral principles from the kind of Platonic realm has no bearing here. Now, this is an interesting case because the autonomy was instrumental in the natural intelligence Singleton, not needed here. And you also can see this happening in various ways. You could have gradually that we mediate more and more using AI. You might also have a kind of Weberian story about our bureaucracy. Since Weber's ideal bureaucracy is kind of a machine, replacing the bureaucrats with AI, he would say, yeah, that's actually an even better logical progression. And you might gradually get a conversion of that. Or, again, the direct handing over. Now, there is a really interesting question for us here. We have kind of painted ourselves into a fun corner. Because what's wrong about not having autonomy and being a pet? Maybe being a pet or a pampered aristocrat under the benevolent rule of AIs is actually a really good thing. And that feels bad to Cyril and me. We kind of, wait a minute. We are painted ourselves in a corner here because we don't make that normative view. A Kantian would just happily say, well, autonomy is a source of a lot of value, and hence it's obviously a bad case. For us, autonomy is instrumental. And this is where you get a fun Darwinian debunking. We have evolved to want autonomy because presumably our ancestors who that didn't go for much autonomy, they tended to be dominated by others and didn't have as many kids. So we can give a nice Darwinian debunking of why we want autonomy. But that doesn't mean it doesn't matter to us if we lack autonomy. We feel bad about it, even if there is a nice evolutionary explanation. So the ethicists encountering Darwinian debunking, they would say, okay, that cost out of that ethical thing actually having force. But an emotional aspect of life, even though we can give an evolutionary account for it, doesn't mean it's debunked. We have evolved to feel romantic love. Romantic love is lovely, and it would be bad if we didn't have that in the world, even though it might have evolved to spread genes. So you can make an argument that actually this is a bad state because we're lacking autonomy. Now, I did a Twitter survey and found that 75% were totally fine giving up their autonomy to the AI overlords anyway. So this might be a minority position, but it's an interesting issue. Okay. So what do we do? And I'm running out of time. I'm going to be super quick here. One way of reasoning about this is actually stealing from rules and finding actually the kind of Rawlsian original position argument. You can actually find ways of reasoning about what kinds of AI we want and make preparations for a situation we don't know much about, but we can actually handle it that way. There is also an interesting idea about pareitotopia. Actually, quite a lot of parts of this go away if it gets sufficiently post-scarcity. Its big cakes are much easier to share. I don't have time to get into that. There is probably what I think is the most promising thing, and this is from game theory. The price of anarchy is the ratio between the optimal solution set by the putative superintelligence and the worst case scenario when people are just individually getting into equilibrium. Now, in the case of existential risk, the price of anarchy is too big. We would actually want probably to have powerful forms of coordination based on AI around that. However, in our normal lives, the price of anarchy is not that bad. Indeed, the price of stability, the normal solution or best one, minus also the loss of autonomy might actually mean that that's not a good choice. So we might actually have a principled reason to want to let the AI maybe run the world if it's aligned enough, but not run our lives. But this needs to be investigated much more properly. So to conclude, normal AI alignment tries to make AI survivable. Second order alignment is about how do you align the kind of emerging AI in a singleton with the natural intelligence singleton, or even mix them in a good way? Can we transfer contents from our current world that are actually good contents into the emerging one? It might also allow new forms of autonomy on the kind of species level. We don't know how to coordinate very well. We can't say that humanity is an autonomous entity, but it might be that with more coordination we could gain that autonomy, at least on accounts that think that autonomy actually has some intrinsic or practical value. That might actually be super valuable. But that's it. Finally, when I was working on this, ChatGPT, and here is the summary according to ChatGPT of what the entire book is about. Thank you.